I did not know his name for the first 11 years he came. He came on the same afternoon each spring, the third Sunday after the thaw, when the lanes of the cemetery at Marrow Hill were soft enough to walk, and the wind had stopped carrying the iron taste of winter. I learned to expect him the way you learn to expect a particular bird back in a particular tree, not by watching for it exactly, but by feeling the year turn and knowing it was near. I would be standing at my husband's stone with a cloth in my hand, working the moss out of the cut letters, and I would look up, and there he would be at the bottom of the slope, a tall man in a plain gray coat, hat in his two hands, waiting at the edge of the row as though he were not sure he had the right to come closer. He was always in plain clothes. That is the first thing I will tell you about him, because it is the thing that took me longest to understand. An ordinary brown hat, a gray wool coat gone soft at the cuffs, boots polished always, but polished the way a private man polishes them, not the way the king's regiments do it, where you can see the clouds move in the leather. He looked like a clerk, or a schoolmaster on his day off, or any of the 1,000 quiet men you pass in the streets of Hesperane and never look at twice. He carried nothing but his hat, and in the crook of one arm, a single bundle wrapped in waxed paper. My husband was Sergeant Thomas Calder of the King's Foot Guards, and he died in the cold months of the Velmark winter, in a war that the histories of our small kingdom of Eddingholm now call, with their usual tidiness, a frontier action. Thomas was 31. I was 26. Our daughter Usald was not yet 2, and she remembers nothing of him but a feeling she cannot name, a warmth she sometimes reaches for in a crowd and does not find. When they brought him home, there was a ceremony, of course. There is always a ceremony. The regiment in its scarlet, the muffled drum, the volley fired over the grave that made me flinch though I had braced for it, the folded colors pressed into my hands by an officer whose face I could not afterward recall. They were very correct. They were very kind, in the way that correctness can be kind. And then the scarlet marched away down the hill, and the drum faded, and the kingdom, which had a great many graves to attend to that year, attended to the others. That is how it is after a war. The honors come all at once in a single bright afternoon, and then they are spent, and the long gray years of the widow are her own to carry. No one is unkind. It is only that the world has a finite store of attention, and the dead are many, and the living press in with their own needs. By the second spring I stood at Thomas's stone alone. By the third I had stopped expecting anyone. And then the third spring, the man in the gray coat came. I did not speak to him that first year. He stood at the bottom of the row with his hat in his hands, and he did not come up to me, and I did not go down to him. And after a while, a long while, 20 minutes, perhaps more, he set his wax paper bundle down at the foot of a grave 4 rows below mine, stood a moment longer with his head bowed, and walked back down the hill the way he had come. I thought he was visiting his own dead. There were a great many of Thomas's regiment in that lower ground. The cold months had filled 4 rows of Marrow Hill in a single season, and the grass over them was still raw. I thought nothing of it, except that it was a small comfort somehow to not be the only living thing on that slope. The next spring he came again, same Sunday, same gray coat, same bundle. And the spring after that, and the one after that. I began, without deciding to watch for him. I would arrange to come on the third Sunday after the thaw, telling myself it was only the weather, and I would work at the stone and feel the year turn and look up, and there he would be. For 11 years, I thought he was mourning his own. It was Usald who learned the truth, in the way children learn things, by walking straight at what adults walk around. She was 13 that spring, all elbows and questions, and she had come with me to the hill because she had reached the age where she wanted to know her father, and there was so little of him left to know. While I worked at the stone, she wandered down the rows reading names aloud, and she came to the grave where the gray-coated man left his bundle, and she read the name on it, and then she came back up to me frowning. "Mama," she said, "the man's flowers, they're on Pell's grave." I did not understand her at first. "Corporal Anders Pell," she said. "I heard you say it, Papa's friend, the one who—" She stopped because she could see my face change. I knew the name. Of course I knew the name. Anders Pell had been Tomas's corporal and his closest friend in the regiment, the two of them inseparable from the day they enlisted, boys together and then men together, and Anders had stood beside Tomas in the line on the cold field in the Wehrmacht winter, and Anders had not come home either. They were buried 4 rows apart on the same hill because that is where the regiment put its dead from that season, in the order they came back, not in the order of who had loved whom. Anders had no wife. His mother had died the year before the war, his father long before that. When they buried Anders Pell, there had been the same volley and the same drum, and a cousin from the coast who came once and never again, and then nothing. Anders Pell had no one. Except, it seemed, the man in the gray coat. I went down to look. The bundle was unwrapped now. Ustled, God forgive her curiosity, had peeled back a corner of the wax paper. Inside was not flowers. Inside was a small loaf of dark bread, the kind they bake in the northern garrisons, dense and seeded and meant to last, and beside it a twist of paper holding a fingerful of coarse salt, and beside that a single brass button polished to a high shine. Bread and salt, and a button. I did not know yet what it meant, but I knew, standing there with the cold coming up out of the ground through my thin shoes, that I had been wrong for 11 years. The man in the gray coat had never once visited his own dead. He had come every spring for 11 springs to the grave of a man with no one, and on his way up the hill, on his way down, he had passed within 4 rows of my Tomas and never presumed, never intruded, never once come up to a widow he had no claim on, to tell her what he did. The next spring I waited for him at the bottom of the hill. I will tell you now what I did not know then, the thing it took me years more to draw out of him in pieces, because he was not a man who told things easily. But you should have it whole, so you understand what I was looking at when I finally stood in his path with my hat strings loose in the spring wind and my heart going like a drum. His name was Edrin Vance. He was a guardsman of the King's Foot, the ceremonial regiment, the scarlet and the bearskin, the still men at the palace gates whom the whole of Hesperane walks past every day and never thinks of as men at all. He was 49 that spring, with 26 years in the regiment, which is a very long time to be a stone. And he had served with Tomas and with Anders Pell, all 3 of them, in the years before the Wehrmacht winter, when the regiment was not only the men at the gates, but the men who went where the kingdom sent them. There is a thing that soldiers do, he told me once much later when he had grown easy enough to tell me things. The night before a hard posting, when men do not know which of them will come back, they make a promise. It is an old custom, older than Eddingholm, older than the King's Foot. Each man chooses a brother and swears to him, "If you fall and I stand, I will not let you go untended. I will come to you. I will bring you bread and salt, that you may not be hungry on the road, and I will bring you something of mine, that you may not be alone on it, and I will come as long as I am able to come." It is not a thing the regiment orders. It is not in any book of regulations. It is a thing the men do for each other in the dark, quietly, and tell no one, because a promise spoken to be admired is not worth the breath that carries it. Edrin Vance had made that promise to Anders Pell on a cold night in a northern garrison, the winter before the Wehrmacht campaign, and Anders had made it to him. And when the order came that sent the line companies to the frontier and held the ceremonial men at their posts in the capital, for the King's Foot cannot all march away. Some must stand the gates while the kingdom looks on, and Edrin's company was held. Edrin Vance had not gone to the cold field. He had stood his post at the palace, immaculate and unmoving, while 4 rows of Marrow Hill filled with men he had eaten and marched and frozen and laughed beside. Tomas among them, and Anders Pell, to whom he had given his word. I am telling this badly, out of order, because that is how it came to me, in fragments over years, drawn out a sentence at a time on the 3rd Sunday after the thaw. Let me go back to the spring. I waited for him at the bottom of the hill. He came up the lane in his gray coat with his bundle in the crook of his arm, and he saw me standing in his path, and he stopped. I watched something cross his face, not fear. He was not a man who feared, but a kind of bracing, the look of a man who has been seen doing a private thing, and does not know if he will be made to explain it. He took his hat off. He was very tall close up, and there was gray at his temples, and his eyes were the pale gray of a winter sky, and they were steady on me in a way that very few men's eyes are steady, without challenge and without flinching, simply present. "Madam," he said, just that. "You come every year," I said. My voice did not sound like mine. 11 years. "I thought you were mourning your own." "No, madam." "You come for Anders Pell." Something moved behind the steadiness then, the smallest thing. "Yes, madam." "Why?" And he told me not the whole of it, not that first day, but the bones of it. That he had served with Pell. That he had given his word. That he was not able to come oftener than the once a year because the regiment's leave fell when it fell, and a man's own life is not entirely his own, but that he had not missed a spring in 11, and that he meant not to miss one while he was able to walk up the hill. He said it plainly, without weight, the way a man tells you his trade. And then he said the thing that undid me. "Your husband was a good soldier, madam, and a better friend to Pell than I was at the end because Tomas was there and I was not." He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "I have wanted these 11 years to tell you that he is well thought of, that he was not only a name on a stone to the men who knew him, but it was not my place to come up to a lady I had not been introduced to and press my grief on hers, so I did not. I came to Pell as I had sworn, and I confess I have stood a moment at the bottom of your row each year, madam, and rendered what respect a man in plain clothes may render. I hope that was not a liberty. I do not cry easily. The early years of being a widow burn that out of you. You learn to keep the cup level or you spill it everywhere and frighten your child. But I stood on Marrow Hill that spring and wept, and the tall man in the gray coat stood and let me, with his hat in his hands and his eyes steady and kind, and did not move to comfort me, because he understood that some grief does not want to be touched. It wants only to be witnessed by someone who knows its weight. That was the beginning of it. I want to be careful here because the thing I am telling you is easily told wrong, and I have heard it told wrong since in the streets and the tea rooms of Hesperane, where the story has grown legs it does not need. People want it to be a romance. It was not. Edrin Vance came up the hill one Sunday a year, and after that first spring he would come up to my row as well as to Pell's, and we would stand a while and speak a little of the dead, and then, as the years softened, of the living, of us old schooling, of his sister in the coast towns, of the small weather of 2 quiet lives. He never once said a word to me that a man could not say to his sister. He never stayed past the hour the light began to go. He was a private man keeping a private vow, and he widened it by a few feet and a few minutes a year to include the widow of the man whose grave lay between him and his sworn brother. That is all, and it was everything. I asked him that first real spring why he had never told the regiment. Surely, I said, they would honor it. Surely a man who keeps such a vow for 11 years deserves. And he stopped me, gently, the only time I ever saw him almost sharp. "Madam," he said, "the moment a thing like this is done to be honored, it is no longer the thing. Pell did not need me to be admired for coming. Pell needed me to come." He looked down the slope to the raw grass of the lower rows. "There are men who do their duty in the light, madam, where it is seen and reckoned and written down. That is a fine thing, and the kingdom could not stand without it. And there are men who do it in the dark, where no one reckons it at all, and that is the truer thing because nothing is paying them back. I would rather be the second kind. If you tell them," and here he looked at me with something that was almost pleading, in a man who I do not think had pleaded for anything in 26 years, "if you tell them, you will turn it into the first kind. And then it is spoiled. Then I am a man being admired and Pell is a story, and the thing we swore in the dark is used. I would rather it stayed ours. So I told no one. For years I told no one. I let the legend of the man in the gray coat be a thing that lived only between two graves and one widow on the third Sunday after the thaw. I learned him slowly, the way you learn a deep river, not all at once, but by the slow accumulation of what it carries. I learned that he had not married because, he said once, the regiment had been his marriage, 26 years of it, and a man should not hold a wife to a husband who belongs to a wall of other men. I learned that he sent half his pay each quarter to Pell's old cousin on the coast, the one who had come to the burial once and never returned, not because the cousin deserved it, but because the cousin was the nearest thing to family Anders Pell had owned, and Edrin felt that some thread, however thin, should still run from the world to the name of the man he had loved. I learned that he had stood the palace gates through 3 rains, that he had been spat at by a drunk and never moved, that he had held a frightened lost girl's hand once when no officer was watching and put her back into her mother's arms, and then come to attention again as though nothing had happened. I learned all of this not from him. He would no more boast of these things than fly, but from the fragments that slipped out, and from a younger guardsman I once met by chance who, when I mentioned the name Edrin Vance, went very still and said only, "Sergeant Vance. We don't make many like him." For Edrin Vance had been made a sergeant by then, and then a color sergeant, the senior soldier of his company, the man the young ones watched to learn how a king's man stands. And still he came up the hill in his plain gray coat, hat in his hands, with bread and salt and a brass button for a man with no one. The higher he rose in the scarlet, the more carefully he kept the gray, as though the two could not be allowed to know about each other, as though the private man and the public one were 2 posts a single soldier stood, and the discipline was in never letting one steal the honor that belonged to the other. The years went by the way years do, faster as they go. Ussold grew up and married a steady young man who builds the long boats at the river mouth, and gave me a grandson with Tomas's exact frown, and the ache of the early widowhood dulled into something I could carry without thinking, the way you carry your own name. And the third Sunday after the thaw came round and came round, and the tall man in the gray coat came up Marrow Hill, a little slower each year, the gray winning at his temples and then taking the whole field, his back still straight but his climb a little longer in the taking. He was 68 the last spring he came up the hill on his own feet. I had grown old too, of course. I do not exempt myself. I came up the hill that spring with a stick of my own and stopped twice on the lane to let my heart catch. But I saw at once that something in him had changed. He came up slower than ever, and at the top of the slope he stood a moment with one hand pressed flat against his own chest, not in any gesture of feeling but in the plain way of a man taking the measure of a thing inside himself that he does not like the measure of. He came to Pell's grave and set down the bundle, bread and salt, and the year's button, and he stood over it longer than his custom. And then he came up to my row, and we stood together at Tomas's stone, and he said, looking not at me but down the long slope to the city and the river beyond, "I do not think I shall make the hill many more times, Madam Calder." I had known him 31 years by then. I knew better than to make a fuss, which he would have hated. "Then we shall have to find you a way up that does not cost so much," I said. He smiled. He had a slow, rare smile like sun coming through a high window, and said nothing, and we stood a while in the spring wind, and after the proper hour he went down the hill, and I watched him go all the way to the bottom, which I had never done before, as though some part of me knew. He did not come the next spring. I waited at the top of the hill on the third Sunday after the thaw with my own bundle ready, for I had taken to bringing bread and salt to Pell's grave on the days Edrin could not, the 2 of us keeping the vow between us now, though I never told him so, fearing he would think I had presumed. The wind blew and the lanes dried and the light went, and the tall man in the gray coat did not come up Marrow Hill, and I knew the way you know these things, the way I had known the year would turn and bring him. It took me 3 weeks and a great deal of asking, for I did not know where he lived. In all those years I had never once asked the man his address, our friendship having lived entirely on one slope of one hill, to learn that Color Sergeant Edrin Vance, retired these 4 years from the King's Foot Guards, had died quietly in the late winter in a set of rooms above a saddler's shop in the old quarter of Hesperane, with a married niece sitting up beside him, and had been buried already. In the plot the regiment keeps for its old men, with a small attendance and a folded flag, and the correct and kindly honors that the kingdom renders to a soldier who has served his time. He had been buried for a month before I learned he was gone. And I sat in my kitchen with the news in my lap, and I felt the old cold come up out of the ground of me, the cold of standing at a stone alone, and I thought, he kept his vow to a man with no one. For 31 springs he climbed a hill so that Anders Pell would not be alone. And in the end they buried Edrin Vance with a month's silence and a niece and a folded flag, and the man who would have come for him, the man Edrin himself had sworn the bread and salt vow with, all those years ago, in the cold northern garrison. That man was Anders Pell, 4 rows down on Marrow Hill, who could not come. There was no one to keep the vow for Edrin Vance. So I decided to keep it myself. And in deciding it, I broke the only promise I had ever made him, the promise to tell no one, because I came to understand, sitting in my cold kitchen, that a vow kept entirely in the dark dies with the man who keeps it, and that there is a kind of darkness that is not humility but only loneliness wearing humility's coat, and I would not let Edrin Vance vanish into it. He had spent 31 years making sure his brother was not forgotten. I would not let him be the forgotten one. I went to the barracks of the King's Foot Guards. I am a small old woman with a stick and a coastal accent, and the young guardsman at the gate looked at me the way the young look at the old, kindly and through me at once, and asked my business. I said I had business with whatever officer was senior that day, concerning Color Sergeant Edrin Vance, retired and lately dead. The young man's face changed at the name, the way that other young man's had changed, decades before. He did not look through me any more. I was brought after some waiting to a captain, a grave, courteous man of perhaps 40, named Harrow, with the look of a soldier who has done his own hard service and come back from it quieter than he went, and I told him the whole of it. The bread and the salt and the button. The 3rd Sunday after the thaw, the 31 springs. The vow sworn in the dark in the northern garrison, and the man who stood the palace gates immaculate while the line companies died, and who paid the only debt left to him in plain gray clothes on a hill, year upon year, and told no one, and asked nothing, and was buried at last with a month's silence because the only man who would have come for him lay 4 rows from the grave he tended. Captain Harrow listened without once interrupting, his hands flat on the desk before him, his eyes on me, and when I had finished he was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "We knew Sergeant Vance went somewhere each spring. The young ones used to wonder. He never said where, and we did not ask because a man's leave is his own." He looked down at his flat hands. "We thought it might be a woman." "It was a man with no one," I said, "and it was a promise. And he kept it for 31 years, and we are the only 2 people alive who know." Captain Harrow stood up from behind his desk. He came around it, and he did a thing I did not expect. He drew himself up before a small old widow with a stick, and he saluted me, slow and full and exact, the salute the King's Foot renders to its honored dead, and held it a long moment, and then he said, very low, "Then let us make sure that we are not the only 2. I want to tell you what they did, because it is the part of the story that the city took up and grew its legs from, and I would rather you had it straight from the one who was there. They could not, of course, undo the quiet burial. Edrin Vance was in the regiment's plot under the correct and kindly honors, and there is a dignity in not disturbing the dead that even the King's Foot will not breach. But there is more than one way to render a man his due, and the King's Foot, when it understands a thing, understands it to the bone. Captain Harrow asked me one question before he did anything. He asked it carefully because he was a careful man and he had understood from how I told it the thing Edrin most feared. "Madam Calder," he said, "Sergeant Vance kept this in the dark on purpose. He believed that the moment it was honored, it was spoiled. If we bring it into the light now, are we doing what he would have wanted or what we want?" It was the right question. It was the question Edrin himself would have asked, and I loved the captain a little for asking it. I had turned it over 100 times in my cold kitchen, and I had my answer ready. "He kept it dark," I said, "so that no living man could pay him back for it, so that the doing of it stayed clean. And that is done now, Captain. He is dead. There is no paying him back. You cannot flatter a man in the regiment's plot. You cannot promote him. You cannot make him proud or vain or comfortable. The thing he feared, that it would become a story about Edrin Vance being admired, that cannot happen now because Edrin Vance is past all admiring." I gripped my stick. What is left is the only thing that was ever really at stake. That Anders Pell was not alone. That a vow sworn in the dark was kept to the last hour a man could keep it. The young ones you spoke of, who watched Sergeant Vance to learn how a king's man stands, they should know how he stood when no one was watching at all. Not to honor him. He is past it. To teach them. That is not spoiling it, Captain. That is the only honest use a man's example was ever put to. Captain Harrow looked at me a long moment, and then he nodded, once, the way soldiers nod when a thing is settled and will not be unsettled. The third Sunday after the next thaw, the King's Foot Guards came to Marrow Hill. Not in the great way, not with the colors and the muffled drum and the volley over the grave. That would have been the loud honoring, the funeral honoring, and it was not what the day was for. They came in the quiet way. A company of them in scarlet marched up the lane between the rows in the soft spring light, and at the top of the slope they did not go to Edrin Vance's grave, for he was not on that hill, and they did not go to my Tomas's. They went to the grave of Corporal Anders Pell, a man with no one, 4 rows down, whose grass had long since healed over, and whose stone I had watched a single man tend for one Sunday a year for 31 years. And there, at the grave of the man Edrin Vance had sworn to and never failed, the company of the King's Foot was halted, and Captain Harrow stepped forward, and he set down at the foot of Pell's stone a small loaf of dark northern bread, and a twist of coarse salt, and a single brass button polished to a high shine. And he told the assembled company and the gathering crowd, for word had gone out, and the lanes of Marrow Hill were lined that day with the people of Hesperane, more of them than I had ever seen on that quiet slope. He told them the whole of it. The vow in the dark, the 31 springs, the plain gray coat, the man who stood the gates in the light and paid his debt in the dark and told no one, so that the doing of it would stay clean. "There is a thing we teach you," Captain Harrow said to the young guardsmen drawn up in their scarlet ranks, and his voice carried down the soft slope to where I stood with Ussold's arm through mine and my grandson on her other side. "We teach you to stand still. We teach you that the discipline is the whole of the work, that a king's man holds his post though the rain comes and the crowd jeers and the fool puts his face an inch from yours. And you think, some of you, when you are young, that the stillness is the thing itself, that if you can only learn to be a stone, you have learned what we have to teach." He laid his white-gloved hand flat on the top of Anders Pell's stone. "You have not. The stillness is only the shape of it. The thing itself is what Sergeant Vance did when there was no post to stand, and no order to keep, and no soul on earth watching to see whether he kept faith or broke it. The thing itself is a man in a plain coat climbing a hill for 31 years to bring bread and salt to a grave, because he gave his word in the dark to a man who could not hold him to it. That is the discipline. The gate is only practice. This," and his hand pressed down once on the cold stone, "this is the thing the gate is practice for." I will not pretend I kept the cup level. I wept openly, an old woman on a hillside, and Ussold wept, and my grandson, who is 12 and at the age where boys are ashamed of tears, wept and did not try to hide it, And down the long slope of Marrow Hill the people of Hesperane wept too, hundreds of them, strangers all, for a man with no one and the man who would not let him be no one. The young guardsmen in their scarlet ranks stood at attention with their eyes forward, and the tears standing in them and not falling, because the discipline held, because that is what the discipline is for, to carry a great weight of feeling across a long open place without spilling a drop of it. Edrin Vance had taught them that, though they had not known his name until that hour. And then the company of the King's Foot rendered at the grave of Corporal Anders Pell the full honors of the regiment, not for Pell alone, though Pell had them at last, 32 years late and more deserved for the waiting, but, as Captain Harrow said, standing very straight in the spring wind, for both of them, for the man who could not come and for the man who came in his place, for Corporal Anders Pell, who was not alone, and for Color Sergeant Edrin Vance, who saw to it. They have made it a custom now. That is the part Edrin would have found hardest, I think, and the part I am most at peace with. The King's Foot Guards come to Marrow Hill every third Sunday after the thaw, a small company in scarlet, and they bring bread and salt and a brass button to the grave of Anders Pell, and they read out, for the new young guardsmen who have joined that year, the account of the vow and the 31 springs. They call it Vance's Day among themselves, though it is not in any official calendar, and the regiment's senior men, who are wise, have been careful to keep it out of one, so that it stays the men's own thing and not the kingdom's. A vow kept in the dark cannot be ordered into the light without dying, but it can be carried forward by men who choose to carry it freely, the way Edrin chose, and that is a different thing, and it lives. I am very old now. I do not think I shall make the hill many more times myself. I have begun to say the words to it that Edrin said to me, that last spring, one hand flat on my chest, taking the measure of a thing I do not like the measure of. But I am not troubled by it the way I once was. When I am gone, there will still be bread and salt on Anders Pell's grave on the third Sunday after the thaw, and a brass button polished high, and a company of young men in scarlet who will be told why, and who will stand still in their grief because a color sergeant they never met taught them how, through a widow they never met, who learned it from him. People ask me, the few who know the whole of it, why I think he did it. Why a man would climb a hill for 31 years for someone who could never know he came. And I have thought about it a great deal, in my cold kitchen and at my husband's stone and now in the long evenings when the light goes early, and I think the answer is the simplest one, and the one the world is least willing to believe. He did it because he had said he would. That is all. There was no audience to win and no reward to gain and no one, for 31 of the years, who even knew his name. There was only a promise made in the dark to a man who fell, and a man who stood, and the long, quiet arithmetic of keeping faith, one hill, one Sunday, one loaf, one year again and again, until he could not climb the hill any more, and then once more in the trying. The histories of Eddingholm will not record him. He is not in the bright single afternoon of the volley and the drum. He is in the gray years after, the ones the widow carries, the ones no one reckons. But I reckon them, I have reckoned them now for you. And I will tell you the thing I have come, in my old age, to believe is truest, the thing Edrin Vance spent a lifetime saying without ever once putting it into words. The honors a man wears in the light are given to him, the honor he keeps in the dark, where nothing pays him back and no one ever knows that one he is. My husband was a good soldier. The man in the gray coat was a good man. They lie 4 rows apart on Marrow Hill, with a corporal between them who had no one and was never, for one single spring of 31, alone. That is the visit he never spoke of. I have spoken of it now, because he is past being spoiled by it, and because somewhere on a hillside this spring, a young man in scarlet is being told the whole of it for the first time, and is learning, before he is old enough to know he is learning it, the only thing the gate was ever practiced for. He came every year. He told no one. He kept his word in the dark to a man who could not hold him to it. There is no higher honor than that, and he wore it where no one could see.